Welcome everyone to History at High Noon, the Museum of Florida History. This is our March program, and we're very excited to be able to offer this to you today. Today's presentation is near and dear to my heart. I love Mission San Luis. I'm very excited to talk about the archaeology of Mission San Luis, new insights into material culture. First off, let me go over some housekeeping rules. We are recording this program. It will be available on the museum's Facebook page tomorrow. So please make sure you have muted your audio. And if you have questions, we will take those questions at the end. You can either type them into chat or we'll take questions over the live stream. Today we have with us Jerry Lee, Senior Archaeologist with the Florida's Bureau of Archaeological Research in the Public Lands Archaeology section. He's been with Mission San Luis for more than 30 years and is very excited in that even after all this time, and all the excavations and research that he's done, he's still able to find and present new information about life at the mission. So I'd like everyone to join with me and welcome Mr. Lee. I turn it over to you.
Thank you, Travis. I'd like to thank the Museum of Florida History for hosting this event and letting me share a little about Mission San Luis with you. And my discussion will focus on several items that have been excavated for some time, but their potential significance has only more recently been recognized. These artifacts, though very few in numbers in some cases, serve to enhance and broaden the story of life at San Luis. I'd like to start with just a little background. This image shows the dozen or so Spanish missions among the Apalachee Indians in their homeland between the Osceola and Apalachee rivers. The mission period in Apalachee province began in 1633 with the founding of the first missions and lasted until 1704, when the province was abandoned after most of the missions were destroyed by the English and their Indian allies. Now, San Luis is number 4 on this list, and Oviedo Chuco, it's marked number 10 over there near the Osceola River, will be referenced once during my presentation. The location given for San Luis is actually its second location, and it was in this spot from about 1656 until July of 1704, when it was burned and abandoned by the Spaniards themselves because of the threat of attack by English allied Indians. A 1675 census listed 1,400 Apalachee Indians served by this mission, and after the 1670s, an unknown but probably considerable number of Spanish colonists settled in and around San Luis. Now, the port of San Marcos is just down to the south, marked number 12, at the confluence of the St. Marks and Wakulla rivers. Its presence and the importance of access to the sea lanes in the development of San Luis can hardly be overstated. Now, this artist's rendering of San Luis was prepared before some of our excavations were conducted. For instance, the kitchen isn't depicted, but it serves to give a good idea of the general settlement plan of the mission at the beginning of the 18th century. The central plaza is shown with the most important public and private structures ranged around it. The council house and chief's residence, the religious complex, the Spanish village on the east and northeast that expanded during the 1680s, the military complex with its blockhouse and palisade, positioned as far north of the town center as possible, while still retaining access to the mission's water source, the seep springs in the ravine, and the presumed trace of the Camino Real, the royal road that connected San Luis with St. Augustine. Now, this image shows all the major excavations conducted at San Luis since 1983, after the state's purchase of the site. Here you can see the excavations of the council house and the chief's house, the religious complex of church, friary, and kitchen, the Spanish village with some houses at the plaza's edge and some further away from the town center, and finally the military complex at the north edge of the site, with its blockhouse surrounded by the palisade and moat. We'll be returning to a few of these excavations when discussing certain artifacts. Many of the Spanish structures, and particularly the wattle and daub residences, have large pits outside them that were the sources of clay utilized in forming both walls and floors. Besides being rich deposits of artifacts like pottery and beads, these pits are valuable because of the preservation of organic items within them, plant and animal remains, which are generally poorly preserved or not preserved at all in most other contexts. One of the clear findings about the animal bones from these pits, and it was initially a surprising finding, was the dominance of domesticated mammals, cattle and pigs, in the diet of the Spaniards at San Luis. Historical documents refer to the Spanish-owned ranches and farms founded in Apalachee province after the 1670s, and the colonists here were consuming beef and pork in greater quantities than in any of the other mission provinces, and even more than the Spaniards in the capital center of St. Augustine. Shipping manifests reflect increasing amounts of agricultural and livestock products being shipped out through the port at today's St. Mark's through the end of the 17th century. Now, some of those historical documents also reference chickens. A 1657 letter from the friars in Apalachee stated that the Indians were so poor that they had little more than 4 pairs of hens. It goes on to relate that the Apalachees bartered chickens for trade goods from the ships at San Marcos. Speaking of the sailors on the ships, it says, they barter 4 hens from one Indian, from another 6, for beads, knives, and other goods. Spanish government officials made periodic visitations of the mission provinces, and an order from the 1694 visitation of Apalachee province stated that all of the natives should strive to raise every type of stock, large and small. In 1703, the governor of La Florida was ill and requested chickens from Apalachee province. Even then, chicken soup was apparently a cure-all. 50 chickens from San Luis were rounded up and sent to Avitachuco to be carried to St. Augustine with a detachment of Apalachee carpenters. So it seems clear that there were a lot of chickens at San Luis, but we have identified fewer than 20 chicken bones from the large pits near those Spanish houses, representing as few as 3 individual chickens. One pit, feature 73 on the east edge of the site, held eggshell fragments preserved in lenses of ash. We presume these were chicken eggs, but overall, the evidence of chickens in the faunal assemblages is pretty sparse. I think the smaller chicken bones simply weren't as likely to be preserved in the acidic soils of San Luis, at least as compared to the bones of larger animals. Now, there seems to be evidence of those chickens even beyond their fragile bones and eggs. This image is of small flakes of chert that exhibit polish and rounded rather than sharp edges. These are a sample of the polished chert flakes from feature 124, a trash deposit just south of the kitchen. You'll note that one, although very smoothed, appears to be the tip of a small arrow point. Now, not only do we find the polished stone flakes, but we've also recognized fragments of a glass with rounded edges, including glass bead fragments. There's enough of the central perforation channel on the example to the far right to identify it as a part of a distinctive type of yellow glass bead. There are also crystal quartz beads and pendants that look cloudy and have their normally sharp edges smoothed, and even imported Asian porcelain with the same sort of polish. We've recognized well over 6,000 of the worn artifacts, and it's a safe bet that hundreds or thousands more of them were present but not identified during the earliest excavations. It looks like these items have been inside a rock tumbler, and I think they have been in a rock tumbler of sorts. You may have heard of the expression rare as hen's teeth. Some birds, including chickens, swallow little pieces of grit that are stored inside their gizzards. Hard foods like seeds pass from the bird's crop to the gizzard, which is a tough muscle that, through a sort of rotary action, uses the grit to grind up their food. The grit within the gizzard serves as the teeth the birds don't have. The gastroliths, another name for them is gizzard stones, enter the archaeological record upon death of the bird, or when the stones get too small to be effective grinders, they are passed. Now, chickens ranging over the mission would have had access to chert flakes, broken glass, porcelain, and beads only through cultural activities like flint knapping, breakage, or just plain loss. Now, there have been a lot of birds, wild and domesticated, that have roamed over San Luis before and after the mission period, but the polished artifacts from mission contexts appear to be good evidence of chickens. Well, where do we find these polished artifacts? Well, the answer is nearly everywhere we have excavated. They occur in a wide range of both Spanish and Apalachee contexts. A more interesting question is, which contexts hold concentrations of the gastroliths? The very highest numbers come from the clay mines reused as trash pits outside the Spanish houses, the same pits that held so few chicken bones. You can see Feature 174 held over 2,900 polished items of chert, glass, and quartz. The high numbers of gastroliths from the trash pits are in part a result of our screening methods. We screened these contexts with very fine mesh to recover small artifacts, and the majority of the polished items are recognized from the fine screened fractions. We mapped this little 2-meter square wall trench structure near the reconstructed Spanish house on the east edge of the plaza. It's in the lower left of this image, the little square wall trench. Now, we defined this little structure. As feature 107. We did little fine screening here, but 5 of the 7 polished chert flakes from this northern excavation block came from within or over this little structure. We defined this slightly larger wall trench structure as feature 169 in the excavations at the northeastern edge of the plaza. It's the linear stains in the soil. It looks like it was appended onto the north wall of a Wattle and Daub residence, but in fact, it predates the Daub structure since it was cut by feature 174, one of the clay sources for the Daub residence. We did more fine screening here, and nearly 50 polished chert flakes were recognized. It's likely that at least one function of both of these small structures was as hen houses or chicken coops. This image just locates you to the Friary and kitchen excavations within the religious complex. We've recognized gastroliths from nearly every building we have excavated at San Luis, but the single structural context that held the greatest number of them is the mission kitchen, where 115 polished items were recognized from its interior. Feature 124, the trash pit just to the south, held a further 258 examples. Including all contexts inside and directly around the kitchen, 410 of the polished artifacts were identified. I think in terms of simple numbers of animals, chickens were probably the most numerous of all the domesticated stock at San Luis. The distribution of the gastroliths indicates the importance of chickens and their eggs in the mission diet for both the Spanish and the Apalachees, a much greater importance than a scant few bones would suggest. Three slate pencil fragments have been recovered from San Luis, but not one has come from a totally pristine mission period context. Nevertheless, they were a part of the Spanish colonial assemblage. They are somewhat rare on terrestrial Spanish colonial sites, but are a little more common on colonial period shipwrecks. On ships, the pencils were used to record navigational information on slate tablets, which were wiped clean when that information changed and, for instance, a new position was plotted. At San Luis, the pencils would also have been used to write temporary or changeable information on slate tablets. These stone pencils are informative on two different levels. First, they are more commonly associated with shipping, and San Luis was intimately tied to export and import through San Marcos. At least one resident of San Luis, Diego de Florencia, owned several ships and became relatively wealthy through that trade. On another level, the broader contexts of where the slate pencils were recovered are of interest. One, the central example in this image, came from within the blockhouse at the fort, and another from a context a little west of the fort. One might expect that recording information on a temporary basis would be important to the functioning of the militia. The third example, the one on the left in this image, was found right next to the north wall of the kitchen. Its recovery here may indicate the importance of literacy in the religious complex. One of the orders from a few of those official mission visitations was to establish schools for children within the mission. Friars, or a capable person appointed by them, were tasked with offering both religious and rudimentary education to children. Some documents specify boys, but others mention children in general. Both boys and girls would have received basic religious education. The presence of the slate pencil in the religious complex might be evidence of the friar's responsibility for teaching. Now, the slate pencils got me thinking about the slate tablets that would have been used with them. The flat tablets are easily broken, and just a few broken ones should create plenty of slate fragments. So I looked at where slate fragments were recorded. Slate is not common at San Luis. In fact, under our analysis system, we only record the weight of slate and not the counts of individual fragments. Anyway, out of over 12,000 analyzed samples across San Luis, slate fragments were recovered in only 79 of them. Of those 79 samples, 51 of them were associated with the Friary. 33 samples inside the Friary produced slate fragments, along with 17 samples exterior of the Friary's walls, and 1 sample at the walkway between the Friary and kitchen. I wish I could tell you that they were all in good mission contexts, but that's not the case. Most of the fragments of slate came from Zone 1, the uppermost level of soil, which contains mission period artifacts along with 19th and 20th century items. Many friary contexts were disturbed by later activities, and some of the fragments came from disturbed locations. Now, a friar may have used a slate tablet or two to record any sort of impermanent information, but it's pretty tempting to connect this concentration of slate fragments at the friary with the education offered by the friar or his assistant. What I can say with confidence is that 65% of the excavated samples at San Luis that produced tabular slate fragments were associated with the friary. It's probably no coincidence that slate pencils were identified from 2 of the 3 major excavation areas that also produced multiple occurrences of tabular slate fragments. Another artifact has only recently been recognized as evidence for the presence of children within the religious complex. Now, these are 4 stone marbles. Marbles as playthings have a very long history, and we've recovered a couple of dozen more recent glass marbles from all across the site. During the 17th century, however, the most common material for marbles was stone. Baked clay, porcelain, and glass became more widely used for marbles after the mid-19th century. 2 of these examples from the religious complex appear to be made of grayish marble, and 2 others of a cream-colored calcareous stone. Now, this image shows where the stone marbles were recovered. 1 was inside the friary, and the other 3 were found between the friary and the church. The southernmost marble, one of the cream-colored examples, was originally identified as a clay marble, but there is no doubt that it is actually stone. Like the slate artifacts, not one of the stone marbles was recovered from a pure mission context. 3 of them came from Zone 1, where mission period and later artifacts are mixed. Nevertheless, the religious complex, and specifically in and near the friary, is the only context at San Luis that has yielded stone marbles. You'll remember that both religious and rudimentary education was supposed to be offered to young mission children at a sort of day school. Either a friar or some other capable person was supposed to be in charge of the school. San Luis would likely have had more Spanish children living here than just about anywhere in La Florida outside of St. Augustine, but I'm uncertain whether more or even most of their education would take place in the home. There may have been even more mestizo children of mixed parentage at the mission, and of course, lots of Apalachee children. Did the friars keep a few marbles for young students to play with? Were the marbles traded from Spanish children to mestizo or Apalachee children in the same way that kids have always traded for prized objects? I don't know the answers to those questions, but the marbles are good evidence for the mission children that would have been in and around the friary. There were a number of requirements for what was considered decent worship in the 17th century. These were wine, olive oil, wheat flour for the host, beeswax for candles, linen, and incense. Apalachee province was one of the few areas of La Florida where wheat could be grown with some success. We didn't recover any wheat from the church, but it was identified from the mission kitchen and from several other contexts. The church excavations yielded thousands of sherds of Spanish olive jars that were probably used to store the sacramental wines and olive oils, along with hundreds of fragments of candle holders made by Apalachee potters for those beeswax candles. Both the olive jar and the colonnaware candle holder fragments were heavily concentrated in the altar end of the church, to the left in this excavation image, or just outside the church to the west. These ceramic fragments are believed to be evidence for the use of incense within the mission church at San Luis. Church inventories from 1681 and 1704 both list metal thuribles, along with incense boats and spoons. The thuribles were the perforated metal vessels in which incense was burned, and they were swung on a chain. The incense boats were metal containers for storing incense, and the spoons were used with them to extract the incense. Many of the incense boats were made to resemble sailing vessels, either very realistically or in a more idealized fashion, hence the name. If fully intact, these sherds would form a disc of about 8 centimeters, or a little over 3 inches in diameter. The top of the disc exhibits ticking around the upper part of its outer edge. The multiple perforations were pushed through from the top and smoothly finished before the disc was fired. An incised line surrounds the perforated area, and other incised lines are visible too. Now, the underside of these fragments is lightly sooted, with carbon deposits indicative of burning. Now, this image shows the contexts within the church that held fragments of the perforated disc. They were recovered from zone, area, and post hole samples, but all from the altar end of the church. So I think the perforated fragments were the lid of an incensario made by an Apalachee potter. A little portable censer of pottery or even metal might have contained burning incense, with the fragrance wafting up through the pierced cover. I have searched for fragments of a small ceramic or even metal vessel that the lid may have covered, but haven't come up with any possibilities. The thuribles and incense boats and spoons listed in the 2 inventories of church furnishings were valuable items of silver or brass. When the Spaniards retreated from Apalachee in 1704, they took with them all of these that they could retrieve, and there isn't much strictly archaeological evidence for incense in any of La Florida's missions. If this little perforated cover was associated with the use of incense, then it is physical evidence that another of the necessities of proper worship was fulfilled at San Luis. It is also significant that, like the candle holders, it was at least partially fulfilled with the assistance of an Apalachee potter. Now, those inventories of church furnishings from 1681 and 1704 give the impression that friars and mission churches had everything necessary to care for the spiritual lives of their charges. They also had items meant to instill a sense of wonder in worshipers. John Hann earlier suggested that based on those inventories, the average mission church in the late 17th century had 13 pictures or paintings depicting Christ or the saints or religious scenes, along with 5 or 6 statues. We have often thought that because of its status as the Spaniards' provincial capital, and because of the relative wealth accumulated at San Luis from its access to markets through San Marcos, San Luis Church might have been more richly decorated than the average mission church. There is definite archaeological evidence for decorative elements carved from limestone at 4 points in the church, but I think there is more. This little silver alloy trident was recovered in 4 mending fragments from a single context in the lower floor deposits of the mission church. Now, it came from Unit 240 North, 318 East, pretty much in the middle of the eastern half of the church. The depth of the excavation level it was found in was from 20 to 32 centimeters below the surface. Now, at first glance, it kind of looks like the business end of a fork, and more than one person thought that's what it might be. Now, I never bought the idea that it was a fork, but I didn't have any better ideas to offer. I noticed that all 3 prongs had carefully finished and beveled edges, while the single point opposite them didn't. The single point was more like a nail. It's actually embarrassing to admit how much time passed before I began thinking that the 3 prongs might be a reference to the religious concept of the Trinity. The 1704 inventory of church furnishings that were taken out of Apalachee province with the retreating Spaniards specifically listed 6 9-rayed halos for the infant Jesus, and they were supposed to be made of silver. I still don't know exactly what a 9-rayed halo looked like. It sounds to me like a single connected object. But the repetition of multiples of 3 started me thinking about halos. If you search 17th century statuary, you'll find some pretty elaborate halos on some of them, and there's often a repetition of the number 3 if you look closely. Again, a reference to the Trinity. Although I was convinced I was on the right track, I never could find exactly what I was thinking of until this past January. Now, this isn't a statue of the infant Jesus, but rather of Jesus of the Passion. It's a wooden statue that's been on display in the Church of San Felipe in Portobello, Panama for well over 200 years. It was moved to San Felipe from an earlier 17th century church, and although this statue's ultimate origins are uncertain, it's possible that it dates to the 17th century. You can see that this statue has a representation of a halo formed by 3 silver tridents. They differ from the San Luis trident in that the 2 outer prongs are sinuous in shape with a straight central prong, while San Luis trident has straight outer prongs and a sinuous central prong. So I believe the San Luis trident is part of a physical representation of a halo and good evidence of the wooden statuary that once decorated the mission church. The fact that the fragments were together in a single context might suggest it was lost during the later years of the mission, perhaps even when the church furniture was being removed for storage in the fort just before the mission's abandonment. Regardless, at some point, one of these little halo elements was dislodged from its statue and incorporated into the floor of San Luis Church. Now, we've always known that chickens were part of the mission diet, that children were involved in activities around the Friary, and that incense was used in a richly decorated church at this mission. All of these activities can be inferred from various Spanish colonial documents. The recognition of archaeological evidence associated with those activities, however, brings them to life in a tangible sense and refines the story of San Luis. Now, I'd like to thank you all for joining us for today's program. I'll remind you that this presentation will be available beginning tomorrow, Wednesday, on the Museum of Florida History's Facebook page.
Oh, thank you very much. Appreciate it. I thoroughly enjoyed that. We got a few moments. Does anyone have any questions? You're welcome to write them in the chat. Might make things a little bit easier if you pull up your chat on in your app. Okay. Last call. Well, Jerry, thank you very much for your informative presentation. Really appreciate you taking the time to share this information with us. I find the statue bit just absolutely fascinating. So thank you. Thank you.
Absolutely. You're welcome.
All right, everyone. Join us next month when we do this once again. And thanks for being with us today.